Morning, everybody, and welcome to Strategy Café with me, Nick Mayhew, founder and managing director of Alembic Strategy. Your shot of leadership inspiration from us this morning. I'm delighted to have so many new subscribers to the cafe this month. This is our monthly leadership magazine, and we try and pick up interesting topics. We've certainly had some fantastic leaders to interview and sort of get hold of their stories and their tips. And today's no exception. I'm completely delighted to be here with Don Randall, who I'm going to introduce in a minute, who is just an exceptional guy and very generous to give us his time this morning for what I hope will be an absolutely fascinating cafe for the next 20 minutes. So our hope is that you find these sessions useful and inspirational for your own leadership challenges. And that kind of just tells you a little bit about us. We're a strategy company, so we help businesses formulate new strategies for pretty much any challenge that they might be facing in the marketplace. The things that are stretching you and your colleagues as leaders, we're pretty good at helping you out with, and offer a quite wide range of support, including M&A, support for the board, strategic thinking, strategic training, coaching, amongst other things. There's different ways to try and tackle your issues. Cafe is a really nice way to connect with you all and give you a feel for what we're like, who we are. And we also do it to share our thinking and hope that that's useful for you. Be very pleased, as always, to hear your suggestions for subjects you'd like us to cover, for improvements you'd like to see. There's a little survey comes out from GoToWebinar at the end. Please fill that in and send it back to us. Really keen to hear from you for other inspirational leaders that you'd like us to interview, because that's kind of the lifeblood of the Strategy Cafe. We do that most times. And don't forget that during this morning's webinar, you can ask Don questions. If you look on your panel, you should see a question area. Everyone will remain muted throughout because there's too many voices on, unfortunately, to have you all on. Lovely that would be. But there's a question area, so feel free to fire your questions for me or for Don into the question area, and we'll pick them up later. The plan is to talk to Don through until about 10:02. I don't know quite how we're going to cram his career into that short period of time. We certainly won't be doing it justice, but it should be really fascinating. I'm going to then wrap up together with Don with some sort of headline notes about situational leadership and strategic thinking. And then we've got an opportunity for Q&A sort of towards the top of the hour. So stay around for that, and hopefully we'll be able to field some of your questions as we go. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce a fantastic gentleman and our leader interviewee today, Don. Don, over to you. Please say hello and introduce yourself.
That's very kind, Nick, and very humbling. Thank you very much, and to everybody online listening. And if I may say, Nick, I've actually quoted you and the company several times since we met, because I think what happens sometimes, we don't look in the mirror at ourselves in the way that you do, and it's quite refreshing, and if not a little bit surprising, when people point out what we think are obvious ways we go about stuff and someone identifies it. So thank you for that. Very briefly, thank you for the nice picture. I think it's what I call my Daniel Craig picture, but don't actually look like him. So I joined the City of London Cadets in 1967. We didn't have career development in 1967 as we do at schools and educational platforms now. My two scout leaders were policemen. One was City of London, one was the Met. The City of London replied quicker. In fact, I'd actually joined the City of London Cadets in September 67 before the Metropolitan Police had even replied. So I don't think much has changed there. Criticism to the Met, but it's a big machine. It works slower. Promoted sergeant in the early 70s, uniform sergeant. And those who were around at that time may remember that Robert Mark was Commissioner of the Met, and there was a big push to rid policing of corruption. And there was a big investigation called Operation Countryman, and the then Commissioner, Peter Marshall, appointed me as a detective sergeant, which was I think I was only one of two ever to go straight from a uniform supervisory rank into what was then the CID. And a most fascinating 18 months at Snow Hill. Was then appointed detective inspector, I think, around early 1980, and attached to the fraud squad, which was quite an interesting period, very siloed organisation at that time. Did a couple of spells back in uniform in various positions of divisional command and operational command, and then was detective superintendent. I say this because I think it was good at the time. I think I was the youngest ever detective superintendent in the city police at the age of 38. Stayed in the fraud squad till 93. Then we had the summary acts of Bishopsgate Bombs, which we might talk about shortly. I left in 1990, late 95, early 96, probably with majoring in fraud, counter-terrorism, investigation and partnership. At 14 wonderful years at JP Morgan, subsequently JP Morgan Chase as the International Director of Security. It's when we created Project Griffin, which we can talk about. And a little heart attack, but it wasn't a little heart attack, in 1987. So I'm now sort of semi-bionic with 5 stents, and 1/3 of my heart muscle doesn't work, but I'm in good form for those who know me. Nothing changes in my life. So in 2008, I became the Director of Security at the Bank of England, a very privileged position, again, to create some change management. And then when Mark Carney arrived in July 2013, he wanted to create a information security division at the bank, and I think he asked me to do it. I did it. It was a very strong, we would like you to do this. I laugh about this and say, well, it's either you do it or you give us a P45, and I decided to do it. But interestingly enough, from a fundamental detective with little or no technical skills, I think I still had a Nokia, one of the original Nokia phones at that time, to become the first ever CISO. Some called it CISO, I call it CISO. And with 2 years to do it, because I was 63 years of age and I intended to do something different at the age of 65. We did it, fantastic team. If anybody wants to talk about how to create a information security division, I can do it from soup to nuts, as the Americans would say. Then once I was 65, I decided to, I actually stayed on as an advisor to the Bank of England for 18 months. But then created my own company, and I now, I like the word advise, Nick, as opposed to consult. I think consult tends to send the wrong message, whereas advisory is more friendly, more engaging. And advice, you can take it or leave it. Whereas consultancy, I tend to think you give a package and say, well, there it is, that's it. So I'm privileged to advise 9 various companies across the globe. So that's my short career, Nick.
That's a good way of putting it. I mean, what a stellar career! It's an amazing time. I love this, and I realise we've got this wrong because this isn't City of London Police, is it? But we were just chatting beforehand over coffee about the fact that when you started, I wasn't born. It's kind of quite scary for me. But just tell us a little bit about what life was like in the early years in the City of London Police, and why this is the wrong picture.
Yeah, the City of London Police, and I know I'm slightly biased. You know, they joke with me that if everybody wants me to go to the West End, I have to take a passport because I'm just in the square mile. For the City of London Police in 1969, it's quite interesting. We didn't have radios at that time, but just a little chronology here. When we launched the Computer Misuse Act, I think it was 1990. I think I was on radio and television. The piece of legislation that is still the primary piece of legislation for cyber. We didn't even have desktop computers in those days, so we're launching legislation. So even in that 23 years or 24 years from joining, but we didn't have radios in 1969.
Yeah.
The Pi Pocket phones actually came out in 1970.
Really?
You know, and the TARDISes, the police boxes, were the only means of communication. You'd go out on a beat on night duty, and if there was an incident, alarm, or anything, the box would flash. And then you'd go along and pick up the phone, and they'd say, go to 60 Cheapside where an alarm is ringing, and that was the communication vehicle. So if we look at, you know, where we've gone on, and it's a sad day today with the anniversary, if that's the right word, of PC Palmer's killing at Westminster, where, you know, we're different times. You know, we didn't wear stab-proof vests in those days. We wore our uniform. Our uniform was more dressed and functional. It was a stark change. And if you go back, I think the television series Heartbeat pretty much reflects that era of policing, if you remember that series.
Yeah. Yeah, really interesting. So this sort of phase, we got to the Bishopsgate Bomb in just a sec, and I'm really keen to talk about that as sort of situational leadership. But this sort of phase led you up to being in the fraud squad and all the way up to detective sergeant and then detective inspector, etc. But I believe, so one of the things you talked about when we were chatting about the early days was you'd find that you sort of turned up for everything. It was sort of always first on the scene. And after a while, that led you to a realization about yourself. Maybe talk about that a little bit, about this early phase of your career, being first on the scene.
Yeah, and that was all the way through my career, but I didn't do it. It was just, you know, my mother, who was a very important person in my life, as most mothers are to their sons and daughters. Always said, if someone pays you money, whether it's bob a job or you're doing the butcher's round or the paper round, you do absolute maximum value. You know, you put the paper through the door, you don't just leave it on the doorstep. You know, that was always my ideology, and I still just had today. I don't turn any challenges down, but I don't see them as challenges, Nick. So whether it be a road traffic accident, a drunk, or a criminal scene, or we end up chasing a felon, old-fashioned word, that down the road, that's what we did. And in the early days, I thought, where's everybody else? You know, and then once you were on the scene, everybody else turned up, and you think, okay. And of course, their reasoning, Nick, was well, you know, the first on scene writes a report. And they didn't want to write the report. But as I matured, it actually, you go through generations, and there were some more mature police officers in 1969 who couldn't deal with the policing reality of 1969 through the 70s and 80s. And the reason they weren't turning up was that they weren't confident to deal with those situations. And once someone was at the scene, they were happy for them to be guided and to be led. But to me, it was natural. And I think it's a very caring thing to understand that you know, some people can deal with arrests, and some people are good at one thing and some people are good at others, but having that mutual respect. But yeah, I was always first on scene, and I don't tell a lot of people about this, but I actually rode the motorcycles for a year. It's a piece of my career I keep quiet because I make a laugh of it. But my partner then was a wonderful man called Brian Renault, and we went to everything. And you know, I can remember the Tower of London bombing in 1973, I think it was. We were actually just booking off duty at about 2:20. The call came out, and we were first on scene at the towers. I can remember our call signs, Nick, 35 and 39.
Yeah.
So that's how we did it. And I never look at myself in that way. I just think, as Mum said, you're paid to do a job, do it and do it well to the best of your ability.
I think it's so fascinating, and it's a really great sort of mentoring lesson out to budding leaders out there to you know, push for that opportunity. And to just, you know, I think that what comes across to me is the natural enthusiasm to sort of soak up the event. And I think, I mean, most of us not being in the forces would, so me certainly, maybe I can't speak for everybody else, but I'd find that whole idea of sort of running into trouble terrifying. I'm not sure how I'd respond. Don't think I could do that, but, you know, I've not been challenged like that, but I don't know, but I'd find it terrifying. On the other hand, just thinking across different leadership aspects, you know, one of the things I think that does set out good leaders is the enjoyment of the challenge of the leadership in their context, and actually finding it maybe less stressful, more fun, just to leap into something more difficult. I think it does mark out people for higher levels of leadership because you get that experience and exposure. I know that the key part of this part of your career was sort of getting rid of fraud and corruption in the forces. I want to come on to St Mary Axe, but just as we transition, I'm going to put the next slide up, but maybe just transitioning into this next one. Maybe just a quick comment on that. You know, I remember you saying they were great policemen, but unfortunately they're just also corrupt.
Yeah, I think, you know, the problem with corruption on a global basis, whether it be in policing or this or whatever, you actually will never rid the world of corruption, although there's been massive steps forward in legislation, understanding, practice, but you have to deal with it. You know, the sadness back in the days of those corrupt police officers and the degrees and facets of corruption is that many of the detectives were first-class detectives. They were excellent detectives. Their detective skills were phenomenal. But they had this streak of corruption in them, which was very, very sad and had to be dealt with. So you had to try and extrapolate from those very good detectives, from their detective skills, and separate those. You know, some of them never got evidence discovered or dealt with, but there was always a suspicion of that. So, you know, I'm not saying every bad is good, but there were some very good people there, and it's an understanding. And the other thing, Nick, if I may, just 1 minute, is when I went back in 1988 to run the operational side of the fraud squad, my colleague John Todd went to the serious fraud office, and I did the operational side. You know, the commissioner's direction to me was change it. I said, Owen, you're going to say any more than that? He said, change it, do what you do well. And what we did, Nick, in that, and this is what I think comes into Bishopsgate as well, that we stopped the silo approach to fraud investigation. So we had a shipping fraud expert, a banking fraud expert, an insurance fraud expert. We made all the detectives omni competent to deal with any type of fraudulent activity as they came in. Yes, you always get specialisation as it matures, but that was quite a revolutionary step. And we had 1988. You know, Mark Polin is now the Chief Constable of North Wales, was one of my detective sergeants. And we had a phenomenal good time in 88 through to 93. I think we revolutionised the way fraud investigation was carried out, and it still carries out now. And of course, the City of London Police is the lead repository for fraud and cybercrime on a national basis. So
I think it's very interesting. It's really interesting. Just come back onto the fraud corruption thing a little bit, and the changes there is sort of inspirational. But the interesting thing about the difficulty of handling some of the blurred lines that happen, and you know, that need for a deep personal ethic and self-discipline when you have a position of authority, which we kind of hear about across the world today. You know, people not holding that line, not breaching it, maybe pretty good at what they do, but nevertheless they've crossed the line somewhere. It's kind of interesting to me about self-leadership, which I think is a key part of being a great leader, is keeping yourself in check and honouring the position, the office that you have, as opposed to personalising it and saying it's about me and maybe breaching some of the rules. I think it's interesting. That leads us to this. I mean, so in a way, I think to the point where you were saying that you happened to be in the office when the news came in about the Bishopsgate bomb. So tell us about this horrific day.
Yeah, that was Saturday. Actually, it's the 25th anniversary. If again, anniversary is the right word. I can't find the right word. The 25th anniversary of the Bishopsgate bomb this coming Easter, the 24th of April. I always joke, Nick, and say I was in my office at like 9 o'clock in the morning, and I make a joke and say I might be because I'm dedicated. It might be because I haven't done my job during the week and I'm catching up, and I leave it open to comment. But I remember, and we did call them lady inspectors in those days. Anne Rees came down. Sadly, she's not with us anymore, and she said, "We've got a problem, sir." And I said, "Yeah, I'm reading the problem." In those days, we had telex, Nick. We didn't have computers or anything else. I think the fax machine only just sort of come in. And I said, "No, I'm reading the telex." He said, "No, sir, we have the problem." And so I went up to the control room, which was then on the 4th floor. And there it was, sitting in Bishopsgate, this lorry, and the calls are coming in. You know, there's a you know, from the proponents of the crime, and we actually created, Nick, what was I was jeans and t-shirt, and we had Saturday morning, the bomb sitting on top of probably one of the most complex railway networks in the world, and definitely within this country. You've got Fenchurch Street, Liverpool Street, you've got the undergrounds, you've got everything there. And we the year before at St Mary Axe, we created a policy of evacuation. Evacuation being go to the basement. Most of the modern buildings will sustain the vortex effect, but we never tested it. And I remember one of the sergeants turning around and he said, "We've got HSB on the phone, Ian Dermott. Sadly, he's no longer with us." And he said, "There's 70 people. What do I do with them?" And I said, "Put them in the basement." And he goes, "They haven't got a basement." I said, "Every building in the City of London's got a basement. Put them in the basement." I perhaps wasn't quite as polite in my language to do that. And they went in the basement, and you will recall all of those, they were a bit dusty when they came out. They had ringing in their ears. And the only person who sadly got injured, other than the photographer who died, was the security guard who was chaperoning everybody downstairs and didn't chaperone himself downstairs. And one of my critical decisions was we had 2 area cars, Alpha 7 and Alpha 8. And behind the vehicle, I think it was the Kuwaiti Bank, which was next to St Ethelbert's. I think the church got destroyed, but now rebuilt. I saw 3 people walk out. Oh my goodness. Yeah. You know, so I sent the area car down the road and down St Mary Axe with their loud hailer saying, "Stay in the building, stay in the building."
And you know there's a bomb, right?
Well, yeah, and at 10:24, bang.
Yeah.
And the lights dipped in the control room at Wood Street, and the noise, the alarms went. I thought, oh my goodness, I've sent the car into the death zone.
Wow.
And I've never been so relieved that it came on the CCTV. You see it coming out of St Mary Axe, turning into Leadenhall Street. But the heroics of those people and the military, and it went off. And sadly, as you know, one person unfortunately died, but that was considerably less than died the year before at St Mary Axe. And then we move into recovery mode, and I think it's a well-known fact, Nick, that 5 tons of glass fell out of the sky that morning.
Right. We can see it here on the picture, can't you? You can see there's no glass in those windows.
No. And then we go into recovery, and of course we didn't know if this was a singular activity or multiple activities, and then the machine starts to work.
Yeah. I mean, just such an incredible example of the need to lead the situation. I'll come on and talk about that in a little bit, but just really interesting. So we must hear about Project Griffin, which I think is this next one. So we're moving on a ways here, but tell us about Project Griffin. Tell us about the idea, how the strategy for this came about, and really keen to hear how about you made this a global phenomenon.
Okay, and the picture is of myself, the former Commissioner Adrian Leppard, and John McClune, who's still at JP Morgan. He joined JP Morgan when he was 16, and forgive me, John, I think John's in his early 60s now. He's been there about 50 years plus, and ran the control room for us, and he got the award. So when I left British Policing, I was very keen to unite the public and private sectors, and my vision was always that the sergeant on muster, the briefing sergeant on the Friday night, once he briefed the constables to go out and do their duty, if he could only brief the private sector guards. And that was always what I wanted to happen. We're talking 1996, it's not that far back, but it's a long way back, and slowly wedged away. And then we, of course, had 9/11. And there was a wonderful man, and Sir David Vaness, as he is now, a true friend and business partner of mine. We were having a modest function at JP Morgan, and Sir David, as he now is, was sitting next to me, and I said, David, 9/11 changed the world. It transformed the world from a counter-terrorist perspective and awareness factor. And I said, David, we've got 120,000 police officers, and we've got 320,000 security guards. Why don't we bring the two together? And David went, okay. And David, at that time, was Assistant Commissioner of Special Operations in the Met, and a phenomenal reach. And he said, I like that. And the City of London Police is a very useful, unique force. It can make things happen. So we had AXO's endorsement, and David did what David does always for fun. I'll endorse it, Don, you make it happen. And we did. And we have 3 strands to Griffin, which still stand today. The first one is the guards are made aware, educated in the realms of terrorism that they never were before, including what devices are, what's happening. The second one is information exchange. We share information. And the third one, which is always a little bit debatable, was cordon support should an incident occur or something happen. That one's been flexed. So we created Project Griffin. We trialled it in September 2003, and we went live in April 2004. It stood us well. It's a global position now. It's in India, Singapore, Australia, South Africa, America. In New York, people online would have heard of SHIELD. SHIELD is Project Griffin. Ray Kelly, the then commissioner, said, Don, I think it's a fantastic idea, but I'm going to say I invented it, and I'm going to change the name, and you weren't here. And those who ever see me, but he gave me a pair of commissioner's cufflinks. I said, but Ray, I'm not here. He goes, you got them on another time. And it's in America, in Vancouver. The deputy chief of Vancouver adopted it 10, 12 years ago. It was in the Winter Olympics in Vancouver. And Griffin is a global and is seen as, I think it's quoted 4 times in Hansard, Nick, as the best example of public-private partnership within British policing and law enforcement on a global basis.
I think it's just such a fantastic thing. Folks, if you're out there listening, there's a huge opportunity for questions here, I'm sure. So look at the questions area and send us some questions. I'm just going to sort of sum up some of the things that I kind of pick out from that. And thank you very much, Don, for the talk through your career and some of the key highlights there. Just really fascinating stuff. And Don, feel free to sort of chip in. So just things that I picked out, and we're talking about situational leadership. I think it's really hard. It's probably one of the hardest things. I mean, Mark Zuckerberg has struggled this last week. He's leader of one of the global giants in technology, has not got to the front of the situation over the stuff on the news about manipulating electoral results with Facebook data. So I think it's really hard. You need to be really proactive and lead from the front. So it's that whole thing of when a situation arises, getting ahead of it. So what that does, I think, is if you do get ahead of it, you tend to get ahead of other people. And one of the things that's really needed is a really clear command, I think, of the detail, the operational detail, because things are unfolding, and also a clear sense of the big picture. And for me, that can come from experience. Many years experience of dealing with difficult situations will give you that sense of what's the big picture, what are my principles, what must I get right, what must I not do. Just naturally have that through experience. But the other way to get that is to really work on it with your team, to really be clear about those things and have that set out in your plan, so that when the situation arises, you don't have to explain what's needed so much to the rest of the leadership team. They just know because the principles are already understood. So I think getting that picture clear up front really helps with the decision making, but it can come from experience. You've got to stay at high level, and you've really got to pay attention to information as it arises. I'm really reminded of Montgomery's stories about the El Alamein campaign, where as the battle unfolded and there was a lot of difficulty in the first few days, he stayed in his caravan and just took intelligence reports. And it wasn't until he heard what he needed to hear, which was about a breakthrough in the north, that he made his first key strategic decision, which was to switch the troops to the north part of the battlefield. So staying on the information as it arises and reacting is so important to have those clear information flows coming through.
I think if I may, Nick,
there's
two things there. I think one is when you drive some of these initiatives, and people still do this today, what's his motivation? What's he trying to achieve? And I've spent a lot of my time, Nick, actually saying, this is my community spirit. It's what I believe in. It's part of my DNA. And in the early days, people say, "Oh, you're just trying to do this because he wants to improve his bonus at JP Morgan or something like that." And then some people do get envious is the wrong word, but it wasn't their idea, so they're reluctant to adopt it. And you always have two camps. That doesn't trouble us really, although it subconsciously occasionally it tweaks in the back of your mind. But the other thing I think, Nick, is understanding the consequence of what you're dealing with. The importance of what you're dealing with. And if I just give you one very quick example, once I did a very small spell in the process office as a uniform sergeant, where there was a backlog of work. And quite frankly, the process was like from a defective tyre to a prosecution for death by dangerous. Now, if you didn't get the summons for defective tyre in 6 months, who really cares? Yeah. But if you mess up the prosecution for death by dangerous driving, where a person's died and a family are bereaved, and it's a real, so you just prioritise that and say, well, the death by dangerous has to be done. If by virtue of focusing on that, we end up missing a few defective tyres or a couple of brake lights that don't work, who really cares? I know it's always a balance, but I've always worked on the consequence and what is the consequence, what is the importance, what is the relative value, which actually leads you to a position of leadership and direction and resourcing. It's probably an oversimplification, but perhaps not.
I don't think so. I think that's kind of what I'm saying. I think you've captured it beautifully, that balance between detail and the big picture. And the key thing about the big picture is understanding how to prioritize. So what is the priority matter? And in roles like yours, it's the pressure is clearly there, because if somebody dies, the consequence is just absolutely grim. In business, that's rare. It can happen, but it's very, very rare. But the consequence for business, more civil, can be very significant. And it's understanding the likely outcome and the priority is the big picture stuff. And knowing which bits of detail to pick, it's the balance between two. So I think you've really captured it, and it does feed into this next slide, which picks up from the book Blink by Malcolm Gladwell, which is about the deep instinct that comes from many years of experience. And he talks about people being able to just tell in a microsecond if something is a fraud or not a fraud, just by the look of it. Something they can almost smell that it's wrong. And that confidence in yourself, that gut that you're right, I think that does come from experience. It comes from experience in the field, seeing it many times, seeing it under pressure. And after a while, that builds up into something special, maybe an emergent capability to sort of smell the wrong or to know the priority. So based on that years of experience, it's about just knowing, which I think is what you're talking about. You just know how to. We've got some great questions coming through. So people stay around. We've got some good questions here as well. So we'll pick them up in a second.
Yeah, I agree with what you just said, and I think that Blink the Gladwell is one that I'm not an avid reader, but I promise you, Nick, I will.
There's a really interesting example in there of from policing in America of it going wrong when people misread and someone got shot because they misread. But it's just how it can go wrong sometimes. Just moving on a little bit to strategic thinking and change leadership. I really love that, the experience, the insight and the proactivity that leads someone like Dom to say, do you know what, we should do this. It's obvious we should do this. I'd like to say there's an emotional content to that. So an excitement about what could be done to improve things, an excitement and emotion about the possibility that something that we could do together. I've seen an opportunity. I've seen how to connect things. So I would describe that as a sort of gain orientation or a growth mindset, seeing a huge opportunity which could easily be done. And it's that visual, that vision thing of seeing the connections, the combined strengths, the insight. What is the emergent strength of putting the police and the security forces together? How could we do that? How would that improve our community? I just think that's really interesting. And then change leadership, just leading on from that. So you've had the vision, you've seen the opportunity, but now you've got to lead it. So it's that willingness again to be first up, to step into the fray, to lead the situation, and taking it right back from call sign 35, I think I heard, on the motorbike down at the bridge. And here we are, many years later with JP Morgan, a willingness still to lead and to promote others. And that strength of belief, my attitude about this, I want to see this happen. I want to lead this. I want to see this done. Working with other people who are significant to make this happen and breaking through those perceived difficulties to sort of politically lead something. And that's really, to me, the essence of strategic leadership. It's that game mindset. It's seeing the opportunity, creating the buy-in to the plan, and then getting on the front foot and politically leading it through until you get something like this, which is a global response to counter-terrorism. I just think it's an amazing story from Dom. So thank you very much.
Yeah, and I think one of the professional tricks, Nick, if I may, and someone pointed this out to me in 1986, another good colleague and friend of mine, Chris Duggan, and the use of the word "we" as opposed to the use of the word "I." It's a massively enabling two-letter word. And it's really significant, the use of, and if anybody ever hears me say "I," just correct me, because I do fundamentally believe in the "we," and the "we" is the embracing, and it's an important, simple word, but it can make such a change.
That's great. So quite interesting this morning. I've had a text in from Rick Manfield, who's CEO of the Securities Institute, who's at an expo listening in. So Rick says, what tips do you have, Dawn, for getting stakeholder buy-in to a project like that?
Okay. Okay, do you mean Project Griffin? How to get it in the early days? What we did on Griffin in the early days, we needed a modest sum of money. So we went to the 10 predominant security companies in the United Kingdom and said, would you contribute to this? Would you participate in this? The margins on security guarding are very small, and there was a concern about resourcing and that adding to the cost and therefore adding to the reducing the margin. So one of the tricks we did on Griffin, and it's quite a good way to reverse it round, is that the cost for the guards attending the awareness day was borne by the end user. So we at JP Morgan paid for the absence of the guards to do the awareness training. So I think, and I'm very, very impressed with what Rick's done since he's taken up that CEO job at the Institute. So well done, Rick. And that's not a patroniser, it's a real statement, is to look at all the elements of what you're trying to achieve. You need a champion. we haven't talked about cross-sector safety and communications, but we're rolling out across the country. You need a champion, you need a leader. Mark Duffy in East, we've got David Ward in the South, we've got Karen Ramirez in the Southwest, and we've got Andrew Nichols in the Midlands at the moment. They're champions. They need to lead. They need to be equally inspirational. So my view is, look at what the gains are, look at what the downsides. You've got to look at what the downsides are. If you look at the downsides and you can back those off, then you're actually, it's almost like, well, how can we allow the guard to be away for 6 hours? Who's going to pay for that? Right? It's a problem. It's a problem that could falter that project. So I just think look at things in the round would be my answer, Nick, and more importantly, focus on the downsides first. Because if you cover those off, the challenges are less, but everybody needs a champion, and the champion will be your key to the door.
I agree with that. It's a fantastic thing about and finding the champions for different aspects of it, people with the energy and enthusiasm to sort of create that momentum for you. It's a great answer, really good answer. So lovely question here from Peter Lavery asking, given your background within the City of London Police and learning from corporate security with JP Morgan and then the Bank of England, what advice would you give to people from the security profession who are keen to progress in security?
Okay, and Peter's a close friend of mine, and we travel together quite a lot. I think the thing is to get the partnership, to get the fair partnership, and I've said this before, Nick, that you've got to get the police talking to the police, you've got to get the private talking to the private, and then you've got to get the private talking to the public. It's a bit of a mouthful, but and there's a lot we can do. I don't buy the argument that we pay our taxes and therefore the police or law enforcement agencies should be doing this. We live in difficult, stressful times where resources and finances are restricted, and the more we can do to harmonise that and add value to it. And sometimes, the value is not purely monetary, Nick. It's time and effort. It's giving your time or giving the resources or the endorsement of your company to actually be supportive of the law enforcement needs. And so Peter knows I'm passionate about partnership and harmonisation, but that's what I would suggest that, we look at the cyber issues these days, and, there's highly qualified cyber technicians out there, and why they become special constables with a dedicated skill within the fraud or cyber world, or they could become volunteers, and they're not going to wear the uniform, they're not taking police people's jobs away, but they're just actually working closer together. And I think that's where great advantages are, both from individuals, from corporates, and from smaller companies. And you don't have to be a JP Morgan to have impact. You can be a two-person small business and add more value than sometimes the bigger corporates. That's my view, Nick.
Wonderful answers, and thank you very much for your generosity and just keeping an eye on the time with questions. So I'm gonna wrap up now. But if people want to send in more questions, I'll pass them through to you, Don, and maybe you can fill them. But thank you for really insightful, absolutely amazing interview this morning. I really thoroughly enjoyed talking to you and look forward to meeting you again and carrying on the chat. Great comments, and I think really, really helpful for people listening, both about the security industry, but also just about leadership at the highest level, kind of at the toughest kind of edge. Really interesting. We haven't even covered the Bank of England. There's a few questions in about that. It's almost like we need to do about 7 of these, I think, to sort of really dig into it. But really good. So thank you, everybody. I hope you have a great day. Just one question from me out to all of you is, what's the one thing? If you're going to take one thing away from today, what's the one thing that you've heard from Don about your own leadership or your colleagues' leadership? What's the one thing that you're going to take away from today and put into practice yourself? If you like today's webinar, check out our past events page, www.alembicstrategy.com. Get involved and then look for the past events area. You'll see this webinar up there shortly. Actually, everything now is on a link to our YouTube channel, which is getting increasingly popular, and you'll see there's loads of our past events up there. We've got some cut down things on there, so you can listen to a little bit of a tip for a couple of minutes. Some great stuff there from Nick Easter. It's a really fantastic webinar on breathing life into your brand by Nikki Fuchs from Office Space in Town. Loads of things, including the ones up on this slide. So go and have a listen. I mean, all of them are inspirational. It's pretty much like a book up there on best tips in leadership already. So just totally proud of that resource. So go and have a look at our YouTube channel. It's a little bit clunky in terms of the sort of technical competencies, but I hope you forgive us for that. But the content, I think, is really amazing. Just so that you're aware, get in touch about this. Don and Giles Fuchs and Nikki from Office Space in Town have very kindly agreed to come and keynote for us on some of this. So we've decided our next London Leaders Forum, which is the 23rd of May, we're going to extend it to an open conference. We're going to run a whole day's conference at St Dunstan's Hill, and then we'll have dinner and networking in the evening overlooking HMS Belfast, just on the north bank of the Thames, down at Lower Thames Street. Just an absolutely beautiful spot. And a whole day on developing your own strategic thinking, your situational leadership, really trying to understand what growth mindset means. Fantastic day full of top tips on how you can develop that with yourself and your team. So get in touch about the 23rd of May and come along to our Leaders Conference, our London Leaders Conference. And don't forget to subscribe to our newsletter, which you can find on the Get Involved page too. I hope you've enjoyed it today. Thank you very much for sticking with us through until just after 9:10. Been an absolutely fantastic seminar this morning. Thank you very much, Don, again, for coming on board and for giving us your thoughts.
Well, thanks very much for the opportunity, Nick. I do appreciate it. Thank you very much.
It's just been a total pleasure. So have a good day, everybody, and we look forward to seeing you next time. The next event will be the conference, and so the next Strategy Café probably will be in June. Look forward to seeing you for that one.